Hello, hi, how are you? I have in mind two videos that I would like to make in response to my previous video. The video that I'm responding to was called, "So when did Jesus actually gather his elect?" And then people commented on that video, and a couple of those comments brought up very common arguments that I really think deserve a response. I don't typically do videos responding to comments, but these particular comments are a perfect jumping off point in order to make these videos. The first video is going to be a response to a common post-mill, sometimes a-mill argument concerning the gathering of the elect. And then the second one is going to be a defense of why I read Matthew 24 the way that I do. So if that's your cup of tea, if that interests you, stick around. In the previous video, this is basically the argument that I was making. I was reading from Matthew 24, and I was emphasizing this particular section. Starting at Matthew 24:29, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." And the basic point that I made was that that particular gathering has not occurred yet. The angelic trumpet gathering of the elect from the four corners of the earth, the four winds of the heavens, hasn't actually occurred yet. And one of the commenters said this: "I heard Jeff Durbin preach that the Greek word for angels means messengers, and so that means preachers, something similar to what I found on Google, quote, for a preterist, gather his elect from the four winds in Matthew 24:31 and Mark 13:27 refers to the historic gathering of believers, the elect, to Christ, which occurred during the first century destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, rather than a future event." He went on to comment, "I don't agree. I am premillennial myself." And I couldn't help but respond, 70 AD was anything but a gathering event. It was a scattering event. Durbin's interpretation is truly reaching and denying what the text says. Now let me say first off that I am not trying to pick a fight with Jeff Durbin. I don't know the man. He and I have never spoken or communicated. I am familiar with the arguments that he makes in favor of postmillennialism, and he and I disagree eschatologically, but I can appreciate the things that he is doing in his efforts to stop abortion, let's say. And so remember that this is about ideas. It's not about people, and I'm not going after him. But the argument that the commenter makes is an argument that Jeff Durbin has made, and I have heard him say it before. He argues that there were a group of Christians in Jerusalem who were familiar with Jesus' teaching about the upcoming destruction of the temple and the city, and therefore they all left Jerusalem and gathered together on the other side of the Jordan in a city called Pella. And so he argues that that gathering of Christians into Pella is somehow a satisfaction of what Jesus said about angels coming blowing a trumpet, gathering his elect from the four winds. Now, of course, there are a lot of problems with that. The first and most obvious problem is that the people who left Jerusalem, if indeed they did the way that Eusebius says, then they left Jerusalem before the tribulation of those days. They left before the city fell. But in Matthew 24, Jesus says that that is going to occur after the tribulation of those days. It's funny, amusing sometimes to listen to post-mill advocates argue for the time language in the Bible. For instance, when they read the book of Revelation, they'll make a great deal of these things must shortly come to pass, that these things are going to occur quickly. And they argue that in order to defend the notion that everything that was described in Revelation happened in 70 AD. Well, the same thing in Matthew 24. They make a great deal of the near demonstrative pronoun, this generation. And so they say that everything that Jesus predicted had to occur during that generation that was still alive while he was on the planet. And then they say a generation's 40 years. So you go from 30 AD to 70 AD. There's your generation. And so that proves that the things that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24 did occur within that generation because of the near demonstrative pronoun. And yet, when reading this particular portion of Matthew 24, apparently those rules just go right out the window because they do take an event that is plainly and clearly said to be after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the tribulation of those days. And they refer to an event that obviously occurred before it, and they say that's the satisfaction of it. I find that really dissatisfying. But I get it. When we read Scripture, we all have a tendency to start with our presuppositions, to start with our system, and then read the Scripture through that lens. And that is typical not only of postmillennialists, but premillennialists can be guilty of that as well. So we have to be careful that we're not forcing our postmillennial or premillennial ideas into a text in order to get the text to say what we want it to say. But a simple face value plain reading of Matthew 24 obviously casts that out into the future, a future gathering of the elect. And that, again, is what I'm going to concentrate on in the next video. Let me talk just briefly about what is called the analogy of faith. The analogy of faith means that we read the Scripture and understand the Scripture, dare I say, interpret the Scripture, according to the Scripture. In other words, we let Scripture interpret Scripture. For instance, when we're reading the book of Revelation and we see symbols, well, those symbols are also found in other places in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And if we go and read those Old Testament passages that utilize those same symbols, they oftentimes give us the interpretation of those symbols. So all we have to do is import that interpretation into our reading of the book of Revelation. The same thing here with Matthew 24. You will notice when you read the text that there are several quotes from the Old Testament. And if you don't take those quotes, those prophecies, into mind when understanding Matthew 24, then you're going to get confused. You're going to start allegorizing. You're going to start reading your system into it. The analogy of faith says that we have to interpret Scripture according to what Scripture says. And in the next video, I'm going to demonstrate that the Old Testament already says a lot about this gathering to come. Christ casts it out future to himself, and very, very importantly, There is nothing in the Bible. If we're going to use the Bible as our primary source of information, understanding, and interpreting, there is nothing said in the Bible about Christians leaving Jerusalem before 70 AD and gathering anywhere else. That's not a reference that anybody makes anywhere. But if you do have biblical references to that gathering, then those certainly ought to be used in your understanding, in your interpreting of Matthew 24. And that turns out to be exactly what we find, that there are Old Testament references to it, and it is something that the Messiah was going to do. Then Jesus comes and is accomplishing it, and then casts it out into the future and says nothing about Christians leaving Jerusalem or gathering in Pella. That just doesn't come up. So I prefer the analogy of faith. I prefer to let Scripture interpret Scripture, and in the next video, that's what we will do. Okay, there's that. I hope that was helpful in some way. I'll talk to you in the next video when I explain why it is that I read Matthew 24 the way that I do. See ya. Bye.